So I'm going to start with this historical kind of gradual settler colonization that we witness. As you can see, the region that is the Uyghur homeland is very much on the periphery of the People's Republic of China and has been on the periphery of all modern states in China. But it's also connected to a lot of other countries to the west and southwest that have been influential. And so a key to the kind of colonization of this area has been the colonial metropoles understanding of the region either as a frontier to keep influences out or as a bridge to project China's influence externally. Next slide, please. So to briefly kind of characterize the initiation of this region's relationship with modern China, we can go back to the mid-18th century. The Qing Empire, the last empire based in China, conquered this area, controlled it really as a dependency rather than a colony for about 100 years. After a century, local revolts in the 1860s expelled Qing rule from the region, but a decade later, the Qing Empire returns, reestablishes control, and makes it a province of the empire in 1884, calling it Xinjiang, or New Territory. At the same time, it institutes a colonial regime with Han settlement and attempts at assimilating local peoples. But this effort largely fails as the empire itself falls apart in 1911 and is succeeded by a Republican nascent Chinese nation state. The Republican Chinese state essentially controls this area much more loosely through Han governors with little oversight from the central government. And in fact, the Soviet Union during much of this time has as much, if not more, influence on events in the region than does the Chinese state. And that's particularly true of the 1930s and 40s. And the last point I want to make here is that in the 30s and 40s, we see the establishment of two regional independent proto-states, both named the Eastern Turkistan Republic. The second one is supported by the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. So we can see the leaderships of the two different republics in this slide. And as you can see, the first republic on the left was of a more Islamic character, and the second republic on the right is more influenced by Soviet socialism. But it's important to note that both of these republics very much were based on an anti-colonial ideology and the idea that this was a region where the Uyghurs and other indigenous Turkic Muslims, it was their homeland. And it was occupied by China. Next slide, please. So talking about the first 40 years of communist rule, I think there was a missed opportunity for decolonization of the relationship between China and this region. And at the same time, there's failed attempts at assimilating the region and integrating it. So first of all, initially, the PRC showed some promise for decolonizing this relationship. Of course, they create the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, although they stopped short of giving it any allowance for secession or any real political autonomy based on the majority ethnic group. And at the same time, by the late 1950s into the 60s and 70s, you see a lot of attempts at assimilation, particularly during the Cultural Revolution. And that includes settlement, development, and assimilation attempts. And there's some successes in terms of major demographic changes. By 1980s, almost 40% of the region's population is Han. But they're mostly isolated in the northern region and do not penetrate the Uyghur majority south. And I think that also the persistent view of this region as a frontier and buffer zone limited the impact of assimilation measures. Thus, in the 1980s, once the Cultural Revolution ends, there's a second opportunity for decolonization, and we see increased religious and cultural freedoms, even discussion of increased ethnic political autonomy. But this is cut short by two tendencies that become important in subsequent years, and that's the importance of developing this region for the benefit of the Chinese economy writ large, and increased fears of ethnic autonomy. Next slide. So that brings us to the reform period, which really is the precursor to where we sit today. Economic reforms in China changed the utility of this region from a frontier and buffer zone to a location for economic growth and international trade, creating an impetus for settlement and development. But that happens at the same time that by the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union fell, the government becomes increasingly concerned that China may face a similar fate and dissolve into separate independent nation states, particularly in the Uyghur region and in Tibet. So we see in the 1980s into the first decade of the 2000s, two complementary processes in the region. One is efforts at development, settlement, and the other is exerting control over the Uyghur population by suppressing any expression that hints at a desire for more self-determination. And this first is branded as separatism and later as terrorism. In short, this situation initiates increased settler colonization of the Uyghur homeland that intensifies through the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s. Next slide. And I think there's a major turning point in 2009 when ethnic riots break out in the capital of the region, Urumqi. I view these riots as emerging from the tensions of state-led development and migration, the in-migration of Han to the region. But this ends up really changing the view both of Uyghurs towards the state and the state towards Uyghurs in many ways. And that happens just prior to the rise of Xi Jinping to power and the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that essentially ushers in a period where there's less tolerance for any resistance to state policies or any contrary views to state policies, and more urgency for development and settlement. This process finally intensifies in the declaration of a people's war on terror through extensive suppression of religion and increased securitization. And that really serves as the precursor to the period we see since 2017, which I view as aiming to destroy the Uyghur and related indigenous nations of the region. Next slide. So since 2017, we see mutually reinforcing policies put in place that appear aimed at facilitating the region's development and settlement by sidelining the indigenous people of the region, ensuring they cannot resist these developments, pacifying them, destroying their social capital and culture, displacing them, and essentially marginalizing them. The intent, I believe, is to destroy their collective identity and solidarity, and to reduce their demographic footprint to allow for unfettered transformation and settler colonization of the region. So while I think the motivations have more to do with state plans for this region, the result is the destruction of indigenous nations and cultures. Next slide. So that brings me to the complex of policies. I think it's important to understand that what's happened since 2017, it can look like a lot of separate atrocities, but in fact, they're very much mutually reinforcing and have very, very targeted results. Next slide. So the first part of this, and I think the part that most people are aware of and is in some ways the most disconcerting, the mass imprisonment and internment coupled with mass surveillance. But I really see this more than anything as an attempt to completely immobilize the indigenous population of this region, to create an atmosphere of fear that essentially ensures that all residents who are not in penal institutions are compliant with whatever other policies the state wishes to undertake. Next slide. And so the state, at the same time, while we have this mass internment and the immobilization of any kind of resistance, we see the state transforming the landscape, destroying mosques and holy shrines, turning historical monuments into tourist sites, and essentially creating urban spaces that are more like the generic urban spaces of China than have any connection to the local culture or history. And this serves to sever, I think, the connection between the indigenous peoples and this region and essentially erase their legacy. Next slide. There's also what I would term cultural replacement, what Lemkin talks about in terms of the two stages of genocide, destroying the cultural pattern of the oppressed and replacing it with that of the oppressors. There's lots of different ways this is happening. It happens in the internment centers. It happens in the residential labor programs, but it also happens in villages through creating flag-raising ceremonies and loyalty ceremonies and political education courses in the evenings. And it happens through projects like a program encouraging interethnic marriage, which essentially encourages Han men to come to the region and marry Uyghur or other indigenous women. And essentially by the regulations of the region, it's criminalized to turn down the hand in marriage of somebody from a different ethnic group or religion. And also the other phenomenon I'd like to just mention briefly is the boarding schools that have proliferated in the region in recent years. And this is particularly targeting families and children who are separated from their parents because their parents are either in internment or in prison or in residential labor programs. And this provides the opportunity to socialize these students in a completely state dictated Han cultural milieu and a Chinese linguistic milieu. Next slide. And then the last point I think I want to make is with the policies of reducing Uyghur population density and the population density of other indigenous peoples in this region really points to the motivations of the state. This is, we think of this in terms of indigenous people like the Native Americans, the removal of the Native Americans. We see a definite removal of this indigenous population, in part through coercive birth control programs that have come to light recently, but also through these residential labor programs that have come to light over the last year in more detail, where we see both former internees being sent to residential factories and just rural residents. Framed as a poverty alleviation program, this program essentially moves local peoples either to residential factories in the region or, more importantly, to residential factories throughout China, where they essentially have limited movement and are under constant control. Last slide. So I think the impact of these policies, when we look at them taken together as mutually reinforcing, their intent to me appears very clear. It's to dismantle the collective identity and potential action of indigenous peoples, to transform their homeland and erase their historical connection to it, to destroy core elements of their social capital and cultural expressions while replacing them with those of the dominant Han, and to reduce their demographic footprint in the region through large-scale labor transfers to residential factories and forced sterilization and birth control. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Robert. I have only